You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, Bob, I found this little graphic that I sent to you that I think sort of creates a nice magazine cover.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, they've managed to, at least with the one-child policy, which is what we'll be discussing mostly today, they have really painted themselves into a corner. I really don't know how long it will take them to work out of that.
Well, thank you for coming on. Let's just give a little introduction that you're Professor Robert Acker and you're calling in on Monday morning, earlier time from Southeast Asia, more specifically from Laos. And you've done an amazing amount of work on this topic of the problems that China is facing. And we're going to kind of go through it step by step. But this graphic was generated not by me, but by a gentleman I met last month, quite an interesting guy. His name is David Nash. He writes a blog called The Segmented World, and he agrees that China has created for itself many problems. He discusses this in his blog called The Segmented World, and I won't plug him any further except to say, you're on the ground in Southeast Asia and you've looked at some of these issues before. So I thought it would be great for us to kind of come on and talk about what your observations are, because you've been studying this stuff for many decades. And so with that introduction, tell us more about what your thoughts are, Bob.
Well, I began thinking about this talk a month ago. There's a huge literature about the Chinese economic crisis has sprung up as the crisis is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. I am not an economist. I'm a geographer. So I don't bring professional expertise to the economy, but there are close resemblances between the economy and the American real property meltdown of 12 or 13 years ago. So it was not wholly unfamiliar to me. So that was one strand, the Chinese economic crisis. The second strand was the China's response to COVID. The lockdown, and then suddenly releasing the lockdown last February. And then the third strand is something that I've been studying for a quarter century or more, called the demographic transition. And this is what I, as a geographer, can bring to the party. And what really struck me was that those three things, China's response to its economy, to its public health crisis, and to its demography, its growing population, all had some strands in common.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is people have talked about this, but they've often talked about this more that it's a problem that Japan has than that it's a problem that China has. I know there's been some touch on China as a result of China having the one-child policy and what that's done. And I know you've given it some thought. So tell us more about what your thinking is.
Japan has, you're correct, the same problem that China does. Japan's is more acute in that it came up sooner. Japan has been dealing with this for the last 15 or 16 years. And by this, I mean a shrinking population, but a large aging population, a large population of retirees and fewer workers to take care of them. China has the same problem. It came on a little later, but it may be more severe because of the after effects of the one-child policy. One child means obviously a very small workforce. The people born before the one-child policy was initiated in 1978 are still there, of course, and they're getting older. They're all about to retire. But the number of workers coming on to support them is decreasing. If you look at the graph of China's population, you'll see it rose rather steeply until the initiation of the one-child policy around 1980. Then it began to slow down, finally slowed to an almost complete halt in uh, the last half decade or so, and is projected to fall quite steeply in the years to come.
Yeah, I mean, it's
And
interesting because I think it's sort of like what we're seeing throughout the world, isn't it? I'm putting the graph up in a bigger format.
it's happening in many countries, not only Japan, not only China. It's happening in Korea. It's happening in Taiwan. I'm giving a talk here at the university next month, and it will not focus on China. It will focus on Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos. The curve is very similar in these countries. Thailand is about at the apex of the curve. Vietnam is a little behind it. It's like cars going down a road, okay? So Japan was the first car, Korea was the second car, China's the third car, Vietnam and Thailand fourth and fifth cars, and then Laos is probably the sixth car. The causes that cause the birth rate to rise and the population to rise are the same, and the causes that cause the birth rate to fall and the population to fall are also the same. What China basically did was to try to goose the process along. And they did that. They successfully caused the slowdown in the population growth, but they kind of overdid it. Okay? So the problems that are now occurring in Japan and Korea are occurring in China more quickly and more severely even than in those other countries.
Yeah, if you look at your curve, your graph, you're kind of suggesting that we're maybe right now, maybe like right this year, so far as China's population is concerned, not having enough childbirths to replace the number of people that are dying. So that effectively the demographic shift is going to be a reduced population from what looks like one.
Well, I tried to indicate that. It doesn't show up very well, but if you look at the vertical line in the middle and then go just to the left of that, I tried to draw that part of the curve in red to show that the population is already starting to shrink.
Right. I mean, we all know, and there's been a lot of research that when you have more infant mortality, families have more kids to replace the ones that don't make it. It's almost like a human instinct to make sure that there's a certain number of children. I guess that dates from the time when children worked on farms and we had much more of an agricultural society, right?
Yes, you've touched on two of the main drivers of the population change. One is the fall of the death rate among children, and the other is the effect of urbanization. And why don't we go to the demographic transition curves and talk about them?
Okay, let me get them up. But in general, it sounds like you are predicting, or maybe these models are predicting, that Xi, the leader of China, has this data and is aware that he has a situation where he's got to imagine some incentives for families to have more children. I mean, they built a lot of housing, but the housing isn't really being used. You've commented on that before. I guess we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But conceptually, they're trying to run sort of an engineered economy that's still communist, but partially engages in a form of capitalism, albeit it's not the same capitalist system that is here in the US. And they throw into the mix this one child policy, which I guess we're now seeing the ramifications of. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Let's start with the demographic transition curve in that case.
Yeah,
Number one. Good. Okay. So I want to discuss, I started by saying that I would discuss three things. One is the demographic side, the population transition in China. The second is the current economic crunch, and the third is their response to COVID. And these things all have several things in common. One is that there are causal links among them, but second, and maybe more profoundly, there are like structural comparisons. In other words, China has this style of doing things, and this style showed up in all three areas, in the area of the demographic transition, in their management of their real estate boom and bust, and in their response to COVID. But let me start with the demographic transition so people know what I'm talking about. I began studying the demographic transition when I was studying Thailand in traditional times, let's say up to 100 years ago. And at that time, there was a model of the demographic transition that had 4 phases, not 5. So if you just put your hand in front of the last phase, you'll see what I was studying 25 years ago. And basically there was a 4-phase model, and you can see high birth rate and high death rate in phase 1, and a low population to go with them.
Right.
And there were reasons why the birth rate was high, why the death rate was high, and why the population was low. The reason for the high birth rate is, first, as Jack said, this is an agricultural society. Children are kind of useful on the farm once they get to be 5, 6, or 7 years old. And people didn't actually know how to control births that much. And there was no role for women economically. I guess they could plant rice, but there was no income-producing role for women outside the house. So there was sort of no competition for a woman's economic effort than raising a family. The death rate was high, particularly among small children and infants, because the water was filthy. There was no such thing as bottled water or purified water or any kind of water that would not give you dysentery. The Thai population had a 100% dysentery rate a century ago, and this was especially devastating to children. So as a lot of children die, they need to be replaced. And so we have a high birth rate to go with a high death rate. So that's phase 1. The population is low, even though the birth rate is high, because the death rate is high. In phase 2, when the death rate begins to fall, why is it falling? Because in Thailand after World War II, international development agencies taught people to boil their drinking water or to bottle their water and buy it. And that resulted, and there was also medical care in many other areas being introduced. And this resulted in a fall in the death rate. And so a gap opened up between the birth rate and the death rate. And of course, the concomitant of that is a sharply rising population, as you can see.
Just to punctuate the point, phase 1 sounds like pre-World War II, sometime in the early...
In Thailand, yes, different places in different countries. It was already, we're in Western Europe, where we were also already at the end of phase 3, okay? But in terms of Asia, in terms of China, or in terms of Vietnam or Laos or Thailand, yes, the end of World War II is the beginning of this process because of the ramifications of the revolution, of course.
You could say that somewhere in this, there's what are sometimes called the various industrial revolutions happening, where innovation is affecting agriculture and then causing shifts in migration over time, right?
Well, the industrial revolution also implies urbanization. And so we're now about to start discussing phase 3. There was a gap between birth rate and death rate in phase 2, rapidly increasing population. In phase 3, the birth rate begins to fall, and for several reasons. Again, 1, fewer children are dying. We don't need as many. 2, people are moving to the city. And although children are an asset on the farm, economically speaking, if you have children, you know that in the city, they are a dead loss, right? And also, so urbanization, and there's also not enough room for the average person to afford an apartment that can support 8 or 10 children. So urbanization by itself starts to bring down the birth rate. In addition to that, there's something broadly referred to as female empowerment, which concretely means education for girls and career or job opportunities outside the home for young women. Now women can produce economically in ways that they could not in the countryside. And so again, now there's a competition for their economic effort. And all this shows up in the fall of the birth rate. As you can see, however, there's a time gap between the fall of the death rate and the fall of the birth rate. And there are reasons for that. The death rate is what the Brits call a Johnny No Mates. Nobody loves the death rate. If there's a way to bring down the death rate, people will do it. And that's all there is to it. There's no resistance to that. When it comes to births, that is much more culturally embedded. Some people take pride in having many children, especially sons. In traditional society, if you're looking forward to an old age without a government pension, needless to say, children are like an insurance policy against old age. And so there's some cultural reason. And of course, women have to be permitted and themselves conceive of working outside the home. Here in Southeast Asia, that's not a big problem. Okay, in most other Asian countries, getting women to be able to leave the home is a much bigger deal. It's a much bigger deal in India. It's an even bigger deal in the Muslim countries of Southwest Asia. Here in Southeast Asia, for whatever reason, there was not that much resistance to the idea of women taking an independent role.
So is the population growing in Laos, for example, right now?
It still is, yes. Laos is now about halfway through phase 3. Okay, Thailand and Vietnam are coming to the end of phase 3, about to enter phase 4. But as I say, it reminds me of a bunch of cars on the road. The cars may be going faster or slower, but the road is only going to one place.
Right. So when you look at this graph, you're talking about this sort of in the context of China and what it's facing as it looks forward to, say, the rest of
when I give my talk at the university here, I will be talking about I'll be talking about Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Thailand, and finally Laos. I won't be talking about China because China's curve of the demographic transition is fairly atypical, and because of the one-child policy. What they really did was force China to go from phase 2 to phase 4 in record time, okay, right, to bring down the growth of the population as fast as possible. China, in that respect, is a little atypical. But let me just finish with the rest of the graph, and then we can go to China.
Okay.
At any rate, eventually, because of urbanization, female empowerment, the fact that you don't need kids, and the fact that you now know how to do birth control, the birth rate falls. The death rate reaches a practical minimum relative to any given state of medical knowledge. It may continue to fall slowly because of advances in medical knowledge, but basically the death rate goes down to a point and stops falling. The birth rate falls, and in 1995, when I began studying this, it was assumed that the birth rate would fall to the same level as the death rate, that the population curve would flatten and stabilize at a high level. Okay, that was an assumption. As of 1995, no country had actually completed phase 4. It was projected that phase 4 would be the last phase because birth rate would be the same, the death rate would be the same, the population would be the same, and that's it. But there was no warrant for that assumption. There was no experience of being in phase 4 for a long time. And in fact, that assumption was not warranted. The birth rate can fall well below the death rate. It's up to people to decide how many kids they want to have. Right. And people are deciding not to have that many.
As a general...
And the result of the birth rate falling, so a new phase had to be added to the model called phase 5, characterized by birth rates lower than death rates and shrinking populations.
Right, but
and Japan and Korea have already entered that phase, and it looks like China and Thailand will be the next.
But as a general proposition, the globe, meaning the Earth, is actually increasing in population because certain other countries
Yes,
are,
it still is.
right? We're on track, I think.
Well,
The statistics I've seen is we're on track to hit 10 billion total people in the world, 10 billion with a B, probably before the end of 2050. Now, they may not be in China, they might be more in India and Africa, and they may not be in Southeast Asia either, right?
I'm sure that they will not be. As for 10 billion in 2050, I would say 2050 is about right for population max. It wouldn't surprise me if it was a couple of years before that or a couple of years after that. These curves are just curves, just approximations. Reality hardly ever closely tracks them. 10 billion also, I would not be surprised if it stopped a little short of that. But 2 points. First, or one main point, is that once the 10 billion is reached, that's it. Then it starts to fall.
Well, didn't I remember many years ago a gentleman at Stanford named Paul Ehrlich talked about there being a population bomb, that he thought that eventually we wouldn't be able to feed ourselves because there would be too many people on planet Earth?
Not eventually. He said within 10 years, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death. That's a direct quote. Okay? Let me just add two more demographic concepts and then get back to Ehrlich. The first concept is called doubling time. If you have something that's growing, how many years will go by before it doubles in size? If you have money earning 5%, okay, how long will it take your money to double? The answer is you divide the natural log of 2, which is 0.694, divided by the growth rate, which in this case is 0.05, 5% growth. And when you do that, you find that your money will double in a little less than 14 years. In terms of population, okay, again, if you have a population growing at 2%, you divide 694 divided by 2, and you will find the population will double in 34 years. If the population is growing at 2.7%, it'll double in 25 years.
Right.
Okay, and that's what China was faced with back in 1966 and 1968. So the idea that the Chinese population, then about 800 million, would by the end of the century reach 1.6 billion was kind of a scary prospect. I'm not saying that China was responding to a non-existent problem. Okay, that was what they were looking at, but especially in the context of the, may I say, panic that gripped not only Pearl Ehrlich, but many, many people in the 1960s and 1970s. At that time, the world population growth rate was 2.1%. They were looking at the world's population doubling every 33 years. Food production is not going to double every 33 years. So hundreds of millions of people will starve to death. Okay, what did he get wrong? Okay, he got two things wrong. One, the fact that the whole world is doing it doesn't mean that that it's not going to change. He should have known, if he'd known anything about the demography, he would have known that in Western Europe it had already slowed from 2.1% to more like 0.2%. Okay, again, the cars on the road. The first cars on the road had already gone through that really high growth rate and had shown that it wasn't going to last forever. The second thing he got wrong was he didn't foresee food production would do a great leap forward. Okay, right, just as he was writing, in fact. The Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation created a food production improvement plan called the Green Revolution. It started in Mexico. It had good success with corn and wheat in the 1950s. In 1960, Ford and Rockefeller created an institute in Philippines to deal with rice called the International Rice Research Institute. And they came out with their first improved variety of rice in 1966. It was so improved that it tripled the amount of rice you could get from any given acre. tripled. Okay, so much for the famine. And ironically, this was contemporaneous with Ehrlich and the gloom and doom shit.
Well,
Okay,
Ehrlich is still alive. He's in his 90s and he's still at Stanford. I wonder
and
what
he's still making a fool of himself, as far as I know.
I wonder what he would say. It would be interesting to hear what he would say about those predictions and whether he thinks they were just too early, because he may still have.
Yeah, basically, he says, yes, it's true. Hundreds of millions of people didn't starve to death. We would probably have noticed if they had. But the Green Revolution is a one-shot deal. Yes, it improved agriculture, but then population will catch up and we'll just have the same problem again. So who told him that there's no further room for improvement in agriculture? I mean, why would I believe that?
Right. So when you
And
look at this
again,
data,
and again, people make these long-term predictions based on short-term data that aren't worth anything. Right here in front of us, when people predicted that phase 4 was the end of everything and everything would stabilize and be fine, why did they believe that? Because they projected the present definitely into the future. That was wrong. Ehrlich projecting 1968 food production indefinitely into the future was wrong again.
right?
The world is a lot more complicated than people think, is what it comes to.
Right.
I mean, the concepts of demography, like the demographic transition graph, seem kind of simple, right?
Right.
And yet people got it wrong in phase 4. Here we are in phase 5. Now we have a shrinking population, a falling birth rate. Will that continue indefinitely? What's the answer to that question?
Well, isn't there also the pace of innovation, because the food production is directly related to all this equipment that's automating farms, and you could argue that automation continues, and artificial intelligence and self-running farm equipment that won't even need operators, or if they have operators, they'll be operating.
Yeah, but that's an issue of the size of the agricultural labor force. Agricultural production is basically how many calories you get per acre.
Right.
Okay, whether it's by robots or by peasants or whatever. And Ehrlich is saying that will flatten out and then the population bomb will explode. Why does he think it'll flatten out? I don't believe it'll flatten out. Why should it?
Right. So
I mean, come on.
When you get done with this analysis of population, how does it play into the other two factors that you've identified?
That's what I'm about to say.
Okay.
So there are several asymmetries in this model. Well, before we get to that, let me finish the China story. So here we are back at the end of phase 2 in the 1960s, with this moral panic going on about population bombs going off. China's doubling time was 25 years or 33 years or something kind of scary. Mao Zedong did not believe in restricting the growth of the population. He thought, I'll probably get into a nuclear war with Russia, and then we'll need all the people we can get to be survivors. I mean, a little on the crazy side, but he did not try to check population growth. He died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping took over. He took one look at the idea of 1.6 billion Chinese in the 1990s, and he thought that is impossible. And so he instituted the one-child policy, again, designed to go from the beginning of phase 3 to the end of the phase 3 in record time by restricting the number of births that Chinese women would have, both through social pressure and especially in village culture, social pressure can be kind of strong. Like Mormons come and pray over you until you're good. Well, Chinese health authorities would come and hector women to get abortions until they were good. So it was effective. You could add high taxes, you could add a smaller housing allotment, and it worked. Okay? The birth rate went way, way down. It met the death rate much sooner than it would have in any other country. The population graph kept rising, but for a shorter period of time. And so China entered phase 4 fairly quickly. So 2 points. One, the fall of the population, the shrinkage of the growth rate of the population, and finally the shrinkage of the population itself. We've been discussing it in terms of the gross population of China, 800 million people or 1.6 billion people, and on and on. But it doesn't affect all segments of the population equally. The people born back in 1950 and 1960 and 1970, in those big years, are still with us. What's shrinking is the size of the workforce. We have a problem. So what to do? Luckily, we have this big agricultural sector. We can move people from the countryside to the city. And so even though the total workforce is shrinking, the size of the urban workforce can be reinforced by constant arrivals from the countryside. And so that will solve that problem, the shrinking urban workforce. Okay? So this is why the housing boom got started. In America in 2008, it started because there was very loose credit. Jack, you may remember this better than I do, but there were all these sort of salami slice credit mechanisms where mortgage risk could be spread. And so we don't have to worry about risk anymore. We can give mortgages to people on no down payment or 5% down payment. And there was this huge boom in credit being made available.
Right.
And it was on shaky foundations, and then it collapsed. China kind of did the same thing, huge boom in credit, and then it got shaky and collapsed. But China did it on purpose. In other words, the Chinese government mandated that the banks give credit to building developers in the hundreds of billions of dollars so that the developers would build hundreds of millions of housing units to accommodate the hundreds of millions of people moving from the countryside to the city. So the first connection between all this demographic stuff and the Chinese and the economic boom and bust in Chinese real estate is that the boom was artificially created to accommodate the people that would then be urbanizing.
It's almost like China should consider opening its immigration policy and give some of that housing to... That
is very, very difficult in Asian countries generally. Japan, as you say, is kind of similar, though slower to develop crisis. So why aren't people migrating to Japan? Because the Japanese won't have them, basically.
Right.
They consider it weird for foreigners to speak Japanese.
Right.
That's just how they are. I mean, one can't argue with it, but it's just not an attractive environment for foreigners. I myself would like a Lao passport. It would be a lot easier for me, but I can't get one. Okay? And China's kind of the same way. It's just not easy to get Asian countries to admit in migration for whatever reason.
So we've got two problems here, which is we've got the shrinking population, and then we've got the fact that there's been overproduction of real estate that probably is mostly going bust. We've observed the Evergrande bankruptcy.
Well, let me talk about the going bust part, and then we'll get back to the population. So we had all these people moving from the countryside to the city and housing being built to accommodate them up until 3 years ago. Then what happened? COVID happened. And China's response to COVID was, again, not totally dissimilar to the United States, but more drastic. In other words, they did lockdowns pending the arrival of vaccines, but their lockdowns were much more severe. People would be locked in their houses for weeks and months at a time. No income, no increase in savings, no ability to move anywhere, let alone from the country to the city. Okay, so all the loans that developers had taken out to build the houses were not producing any income, and all the developers were up against the wall. So we had, again, drastic increase in the housing market because of China's response to the demographic problem. Now we have a drastic contraction in the housing market because of their response to the COVID problem. And the Chinese government actually made the contraction worse than it need have been by telling that they told banks, give credit to anybody, and then they told them, don't give credit to anybody. So of course developers are going bankrupt. Yeah, this is what I meant by structural similarities. The China's government feels able to intervene massively in society changing ways. The one-child policy is an example of that. The free credit policy is another example. The lockdown policy is another example. The cut out all the credit is another example. Okay? And it doesn't always work because people don't always know what they're doing. They think they do, but they don't.
Right. It's almost at the level of, does communism work, or is the magic of capitalism that there's such decentralization of decision making that the market can somehow adjust and get to equilibrium a lot faster than central control can? It's almost at that level, right?
Yes. I mean, the bigger the government, the slower it is to respond to things. It's a lot easier to maneuver a sailboat than an oil tanker.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
When you look at all this data, what do you see the choices are for Chairman Z, right? He's got to be wondering what the best thing to do at this point is, right?
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode of The Valley Current.